ask for it from us, we would be happy to share this. So coming back to the discussion, this is important because, these deliberations are important because many of the comments which were given when this in the initial comment phase has been taken into consideration. So before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Please keep your audio muted in case you're not speaking. That's a request to everyone in the call. Also, we have shared the questions received by the panelists. Request if you could mute your audio. Just a moment. We've shared many of the questions we've received with the panelists, so they may be speaking about it when they are speaking. In case you have any questions or comments, please post it in the chat and we will take it during the interactive session. While making any intervention, please state your name and affiliation clearly. So the agenda, I would be pasting it in the chat. It would start with introduction, a brief summary given by Shahana. Then we would have question and answers being shared by, with the committee members by Rahul. We would then be having the viewpoints of the various committee members and a discussion, an open discussion with the audience, if they wish to ask any questions to the committee members or speakers, and the discussion would be summarized at the end. So, when we talk about this report, many of you may be aware that a committee of experts under the chairmanship of Sri Krish Gopalakrishnan was set up in September 2019 to deliberate on the non-personal data governance framework. And a year later, in September 2020, the committee published its first report for public consultation, which had approximately 1,500 submissions. Now the committee has come up with a revised report, and it has many, I would say it is a progressive report because many of the suggestions has been taken into consideration. For example, looking at limiting the purpose of, purpose limitation of the data, or taking out data sharing between private entities out of the scope, or not taking the entire raw data, but only specific data fields as and when required. Also discussions about creating an NPD legislation. I would not go into it much because we have a diverse set of experts, such as Shahana Chatterjee from Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas and Company, Astha Kapoor from APTI, Professor Vishwanath Pingali from IIM Ahmedabad, Shubhashish Bhadra, who had been there in our previous discussion from Omidyar Network, Amol Kulkarni from CUTS, who would be sharing their perspective on various aspects of this topic. And I'm also glad that two members of the committee of experts, Parminder Jeet Singh from IT for Change and Professor Kumara Garu from IIIT Delhi, have taken out the time to join this discussion, to share their views on the report, and also to respond and clarify to many of the doubts which we have. So the session would be moderated by Rahul and me, and we encourage all of you to participate and share your comments and suggestions during this session. So without much ado, I would now request Shahana to please share an overview of the report, its salient features, and how it is different from the previous report. Shahana, over to you.
Thank you, Amrita. Good afternoon, everyone here. Thank you for inviting us to this session, which I think is extremely important and timely. And Amrita, I join you in saying that we're very lucky to have two of the committee members here. So it promises to be a fruitful discussion. I have been asked to give a very quick overview of the updated or the revised report of the expert committee. So I will do that in about 7 to 10 minutes. I'm going to try, Amrita, I think you might have to make me host so that I can share my screen.
Just give me a moment, Shahana. I will make you the host. Yes, please go ahead, Shahana.
Great, thank you. So, like Amrita said, that I'm going to spend about 7 or 10 minutes just giving everyone a very quick overview of what the revised report contains. So, as most of you know, that there was an expert committee that was set up by NPD, which over 2019 and 20 met various representatives from various sectors, held discussion with various stakeholders to come up with a report around July of last year, based on which it received about 1,500 pieces of feedback from individuals and from organizations. The report, the updated or revised report that was released last year, was really uh,
Request others to please mute yourself.
thank you. The focus of this revised report was really to simplify the recommendations for what sort of a governance framework should be established for non-personal data. And this was, based on, I think, acknowledged on a lot of the feedback that the expert committee received. And so the focus really was to simplify the recommendations, to simplify the framework, and to simplify the principles on which any governance framework would be established. The revised report also provides a lot more clarity on the data sharing framework, which is proposed to be implemented. And I'll explain that in just a minute. And the other key aspect of the revised report was the discussion and the focus on the contours of a non-personal data governance framework with other existing frameworks, including proposed laws such as the PDP bill. Now, with that as the focus, I'm going to spend the next few slides just discussing what the key highlights or the key changes have been. Starting with the data sharing framework itself, mandatory data sharing has been retained as a recommendation, but the scope has been very significantly narrowed. Data sharing, the report now recommends, should be restricted to instances of creation of what is being called high value data sets, and we'll get to that subsequently, and for the creation of metadata directories. And so therefore the report also acknowledges and states that to the extent that data sharing for sovereign purposes, or for commercial B2B data sharing, is all outside of the scope of this report, and therefore has not really been dealt with and should not be subject to the kind of data sharing obligations that have been discussed here. In keeping with the exclusions, the report also clarifies that inferred data or derived data, which could be considered proprietary data, will also be excluded from the scope of the data sharing obligations discussed. Now, the data sharing obligations are, like I said earlier, going to be restricted to the creation of these high value data sets. Now, what are these data sets? These data sets have been described as anything that will create a benefit for the larger community, that can be leveraged for a public good. And this is a theme that we see recurring throughout the report, is that the focus really is on creating and leveraging these data sets for a public good. These data sets are to be used only in the interest of the community, and a lot of the nuances and guidelines for how these data sets are to be set up, what are the thresholds, what are the guiding principles, etc., have been left to the NPDA. But the fundamental principle that has been recommended in this report is that these high value data sets should be something that is beneficial to the community at large. An example of a high value data set could be a data set on the coverage of the COVID-19 vaccine, for example. The report also talks about and gives more clarity on the role of the various entities and the various stakeholders in the NPD ecosystem. So for those of you familiar with the earlier iteration of the report, there was a fairly complex ecosystem that had been recommended. And again, staying with the principle of simplifying the recommendations, the report does clarify what the entities, what the expected roles and responsibilities of the different entities will be. So data custodians are entities that process non-personal data. These entities, similar to data fiduciaries, the report recommends that these entities should have a duty of care to the community from which the non-personal data is derived. There's also, a category of data processors, which are entities that simply process NPD on behalf of a data custodian. And the report suggests that the data sharing obligations should not be extended to data processors. Now, the most critical entity in this entire ecosystem is the data trustee. Uh, the data trustee could be either a government entity, a ministry or an agency of the government, or it could be a not-for-profit entity. So a Section 8 company, for example. The data trustees are really the entities that are, meant to create, hold, and manage these high-value data sets. And these are the entities that, will also provide the access to these high-value data sets to different data requesters. Data trustees have also will also be expected to owe duty of care, and will be expected to handle the HVDs in a manner that most significantly benefits the community. Now, separately, but also related to these different entities, is the concept of a data business. Now, the category has been retained, the category or the concept of data business has been retained from the earlier report, but what has been clarified, perhaps in reaction to some of the feedback, is that this is really not a separate vertical or a separate sector that is being created. This is a horizontal concept that will apply pretty much to any entity that is processing NPD. What the report recommends is registration for data businesses above a certain threshold. This threshold is to be determined by the NPDA, the Non-Personal Data Authority, as and when it is to be set up. But to the extent that there are data businesses that are required to register, there will be additional disclosure obligations that attach to these registered data businesses. Now, what is the idea behind these data businesses is that data businesses will be, in the first instance, expected to share metadata. Metadata, simply put, as all of you are familiar with it, is just data about data. So data businesses will be expected to share metadata with the NPDA. The NPDA will be
Kindly mute yourself, please.
The NPDA will be responsible for maintaining a directory of the metadata that has been provided to it, and will provide open access to this directory. The idea behind this is that this is the kind of the first step in the data sharing framework, where a data trustee will be able to look at this directory, identify the different business custodians who may have relevant data sets required for the creation of a particular HVD. And then the data trustee will reach out to those data custodians for sharing of that particular data set. Now, the other two important issues, in my view, in this report, is the concept of community data. Now, again, the concept has been retained from the earlier report, and there has been, more focus given on the fact that the community from which the non-personal data is being derived really does have a right to enjoy benefits that are created from the processing of that data, or from the potential processing of that data. And what the report also stresses on is that given the nature of this data, given the nature of this, of the rights and the obligations that we're talking about, that there really does have to be whole new framework that has to be thought of for the governance of this type of data, and especially for the kind of data sharing obligations that have been thought of. Now, and finally, just to kind of focus on the interplay between the PDP bill and the NPD framework in this report, is that the report really stresses on the fact that NPD governance should be separated from the framework being thought of for the governance of personal data. And the report really stresses on the fact that to the extent that the PDP bill carries provisions that might be a gateway for governance of NPD, those provisions should in fact be deleted, and the governance of NPD should really be thought of independently and on its own. Now, what the report also suggests is that to the extent that there is non-personal data which is anonymized sensitive data, that type of NPD should carry the sensitivity of the underlying data as far as the storage requirements are concerned. And what this basically would suggest is that to the extent that there are storage provisions under the PDP bill that are recommended for sensitive personal data, similar storage requirements would apply to sensitive non-personal data. And then finally, the report also suggests that consent requirements apply to the anonymization of data in a way that data subjects will have the ability to opt out of having their personal data be anonymized. Now, just to quickly give our audience here a visual representation of how the data sharing obligations would play out, what the data flow would really look like, is just this slide that I thought might be helpful. So to begin with, there will be certain data businesses that will have to register. Data businesses, and this doesn't apply to only the registered data businesses, but generically to all data businesses, they will have to make available metadata to the NPDA. The metadata directory will be maintained by the NPDA. The data trustee will then raise specific data requests on data custodians based on a review of the directory. Data trustees will be expected to request or raise these data requests to all businesses in a particular sector or in relation to the creation of that HVD in a non-discriminatory manner. So this would mean that a data trustee would have to go to all similarly placed businesses in a sector and not just go to one data custodian when it is trying to create that high value data set. Now, to the extent that there may be a dispute about the sharing of the data based on a data request that a trustee has made, that will be adjudicated by the NPDA, which will determine whether or not that data should be shared. And then, once the data trustee has pulled all of the data from the different data custodians, it will create the high value data set. This high value data set will be available to data requesters, and data requesters could just be any data business in India. They could place requests with the data trustee. In comparison, the earlier report had contemplated raising requests directly with the data custodians. That has now been changed. So data requesters will now place their requests to access the HVD directly with the data trustees. And data trustees have been given an opportunity to charge a nominal rate for this type of sharing. So that's an overview of the recommendations in the updated or the revised report. And we do have the opportunity of discussing this further with the committee members and the panelists. So Amrita, with that, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Shahana. So we have our expert panelists, and the next section, I would invite Rahul Sharma to moderate. He would be asking a few questions to the the committee members. There are a few more questions which have come to us, which perhaps Rahul, after you finish, if we have time, I will take it on. And, after the interventions of the committee members, if even the panelists have a question, they could raise it when they are speaking. So Rahul, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Amrita, and thank you, Shahana, for the presentation. And thanks to the committee members who are available and are willing to discuss the broad contours on how they envision this framework. And I really see and really thank the committee members for taking out time for not only preparing this revised NPD report in a very short duration of time, but also making efforts to evangelize the concepts. So with that, we have a panel discussion following this, that will discuss the detailed concepts of what is being presented in the report. But before that, I wanted to, given the opportunity that we have two committee members, Parminder and Professor PK, we wanted to discuss some of the broad things, what transpired that led to this work. So my first question to both Parminder and Professor PK, and you can decide, you can answer each or both as you decide. But the first question is the scope, when this committee was formed, and it's also given in the report, it seems to be very fairly broad. It says, to make specific suggestions for consideration of government on regulation of non-personal data. But in the first part of committee's report and also the second part, it seems to have further narrowed down on establishing rights of India and its community over NPD and creating a data sharing framework. And in a lot of places, the report also says that it's left. Some of these things have been left out of scope for this. So we want to learn from you, what transpired here and why are we narrowing this? And do you think that, since the government is envisioning to create a broader framework for regulating non-personal data, so do you think the leftover parts will be done by the government itself? And when this report is presented to the government, will the government look at it and say that, okay, this report deals in very specific context in a very detailed manner, but there are also some parts which are required for regulation of the entire, non-personal data space. So can you delve some highlights into what were the discussions in the committee members on how they were thinking about this? Parminder?
Parminder, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Rahul. Though, I should go by the questions you ask. I do not want to spend too much time on what the committee did not do, because there is a reason for it. NPD is like everything. And if you were given the charge of go and find out governance system for everything, then you have a task of figuring out what is the most important thing which I should do. And where confusion by trying to do everything creates a problem for the most important part. And therefore, the committee went with what has become the most important part. And the most important part has become is that there is data which is, monopolized by, companies who take it as their competitive advantage. And data infrastructures is an issue which has been talked about all over the world. And if India has to develop a digital industry, we need data infrastructures. And how can those data infrastructures be created and we can have a vibrant digital and AI industry? Now, that is one purpose the committee chose to focus, because this is something nobody has done work on, really. And that's just the reason to do one good thing very well, and which is the most important thing in NPD governance. And I don't want to discuss too much on why we did not talk about NPD with the government. For example, there's NPD with government, whose governance has to be done vis-a-vis how it is shared with the people. Then there's an NPD for sovereign purpose, which government takes, which the committee says we leave out. There are other NPDs like business data with platforms. The Amazon traders have data with the platforms. A Digital Markets Act have come in the EU, which does a very beautiful job of dealing with this NPD. So I just request, having said all these things, like let's focus back to that very important part which committee did do. Though I can understand the curiosity about why they did not do everything else.
So thank you. Look, Parvinder, so that's what we'll discuss in the rest of these sessions. So, but this I just wanted to get out because
I get it. From outside, the people would find like that. So I wanted to just clarify. Yes.
Okay, Professor PK, do you want to respond to this, or should I move on to the next question?
Yeah, I'll just abstract what Parvinder said as a professor, right? I see you introduced some professors on the call. So as a professor, I would say that, look, I think if, I teach this also, saying that, look, if you're trying to solve a problem, right, and you say that students come and say that, what is the project you're doing? The app that I'm building will solve all problems in security. Sub-security problem solve karlega. वो तो होगा ही नहीं ना. Any design that is done for everybody is actually design done for nobody. That's what is probably the philosophy that we took, and we went on discussing. And as Parvinder said, we focused on a few things that all of us are also comfortable with. It also depends on the composition of the committee. It also depended on what all we got as inputs. That's what I would say.
Sure, thank you. So as I understand, so once the committee finalizes and submits its work, the government will definitely take this into and try to see how it implements this. But since the government of mandate is not just the work which is done by committee, but the larger structure, so the rest of the work I think will be done by government itself, right? Because they want to look at it from a larger landscape viewpoint. So this is what I wanted to do. So let me move on to the second part. I mean, the report aptly sort of, highlights the challenges between the personal data, the non-personal data, and offers illustrative examples on how do we delineate them. Importantly, also, it recognizes, the harms which are associated with the personal data. And once, it is converted to non-personal data, but it is then, re-identified, then, it will create challenges. So there have to be, there are certain regulatory overlaps which sort of exist. And hence, with all the deliberations, the committee proposes setting up a non-personal data authority like NPD, it's an authority that starts with the word non, but just a temporary name. So, and I've also heard in different discussions, the focusing on the aspects of having a separate regulator for this. So why do you think that a single data protection regulator that covers both personal and non-data personal through maybe through separate divisions would not work? And why is committee convinced that and absolutely necessary for for achieving the stated purpose in the report, you need a separate regulator? Your brief comments.
Yeah. So I mean, okay. First of all, I love that you're noting that that's the only authority which starts with the word non, which I never noticed. It's really funny to have a name with non. So it's almost apologetic, No, I'm not what you think I am. Anyway, so I mean, your question is very easy to answer vis-a-vis what we just discussed earlier, right?
Yeah.
Even when we were discussing NPD,
Sanjay.
the world of even NPD was found to be so
नहीं कोई बात नहीं,
huge.
आज meeting में
Mr. Bhanu
Yes,
Saini
you
ji,
can
can you
mute
please
yourself.
mute? Yes, thank you.
Amol, there's just a request. You've been made a host by mistake. Could you
अच्छा,
just
अच्छा.
be a co-host? Then
Okay.
Amrita, we can also mute
कोई
participants.
You can, as a co-host. I am no longer a co-host.
कोई बात नहीं और सब ठीक ठाक. चलो
Okay,
कल
let me
ऐसा
mute.
कर.
Okay, I've muted him. Okay, please, Parminder, go ahead.
Yeah, that's so as we were earlier discussing just now, right? Even in the
Yeah.
NPD world, data is everything. Data is about me, data is about health, data is about ports. You mentioned data is about kitchens, data is about playgrounds. You tell me what data is about. Data is a horizontal thing across every civilizational activity. So
Right.
even in NPD, we found, as you were discussing earlier, that I mean, there's so much to do. Just do the biggest, most important thing. So that way, trying to ask somebody to do everything is making, as PK was saying, a complete design for failure. Having two different people at least thinking, one from a data about a person, which is a huge area, and other thinking of non-personal data whose salience lies in its economic value more than its human rights value. Both are there, but the salience is. So I think that separation is as important as agriculture ministry is different from, I don't know, industry ministry or something.
Professor PK, do you want to add?
No, I think it's fair. I think Parminder said this specific question we have discussed in many times, saying how we should place it, where should it be. Yeah, so all options are thought about.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'll move on to the next question, which, so I'll start going into some specifics. So one is, and this requires certain explanation. So because this report creates a new web of entities and introduces a lot of new vocabulary for people to understand and digest. Prominently, the data trustee has a very important role. You have data businesses, policy switch, so many things. So can you Parminder briefly try and explain on that? Are we sort of envisioning it moving to a completely different setup altogether with everything newly created? And how do we reconcile this with the existing the communities, forums which already exist for for data sharing or for exchange? Just your brief sense on this.
There are no existing forums for data exchange and data markets. I'm a researcher in this area. I mean, these kind of things get talked about. There are none. You name and I can talk about it. One, you go into a business. You go to Kirloskar Industries, who does some, manufactures some machines. You go to an agriculture company. You go to a playthings making company. In the boardrooms, everybody is saying with data, everything is different. That's what every boardroom is talking. And you have seen industry. Data has changed. People are making matrices, which are supposed to be intelligent and data-based. What's left then? So when everything has changed in that kind of fundamental manner, the question was, should India wait? I want to say that EU is going to come up with mandatory data sharing soon. And somehow we have this habit of, if the West does it, we give it much more respect. I'm sorry being so blunt, that India is facing a huge challenge. India first time has certain expertise in digital area. So should we be afraid to bring out new concepts, new ideas? And I'm very sure when you bring up new ideas, new concepts, maybe 1/3 of them are not that great. Maybe 1/4 of them are wrong. But should you really want India not to come up with real policy responses to the digital issues which fill newspapers all around us? We want to discuss Twitter and Trump, but we don't want to discuss what to do about it. And if somebody wants to do something about it, says there are new terms and new ideas. I'm not saying that you are criticizing, but we are into a world, if policymakers are to take their responsibility seriously, they have to venture. It's like a startup venturing. You have to venture. You have to produce new concepts. And that's why there were 2 rounds of consultation. Tell what concepts are wrong, where are they wrong, we'll correct them. But waiting thinking that others should do it first, whether we are in congruence with the world for the last 80 years. That's not the new digital world. That's not the new data world. And if the policymakers do not take responsibility, the main question is who suffers most? The marginal people, small businesses, small Amazon trader, a small agriculturalist, countries of the South vis-a-vis US and China, they are the ones who suffer. And that's the job of policymakers. When there is a responsibility, go ahead, do what is needed, take the risk, make mistakes, give new ideas, let them be criticized. That's the whole point.
Yes, so I completely agree. Like, this is a thought leadership work which has come, and like we really appreciate putting out a new structure, a new framework, giving out, setting a new direction in terms of how we can imagine this space, thinking like this. So I think that's really appreciable. And
no, I'm sorry, I'll just add one thing, Rahul.
Yeah.
Does this question not bother you people or everybody that data, everybody says, economy says, everybody says, is the single most valuable thing? There is no framework around the value of data. There is no framework about property rights or economic rights around data. Is it the issue is itself discordant? It's kind of a strange, funny thing that there isn't then, because if there is a lawlessness around data, you know who wins. And if somebody is producing the rule of law around data, that's a venture somebody has taken up. And there will be mistakes, but we'll take 4 steps forward, 1 step back, but that was needed. Sorry, I mean, I just came in because I thought that was...
So Rahul?
Yeah, go ahead, Professor.
One or two comments. So I think, what Parminder said last time, this was the first thing I got actually very excited about. So we talked about data. I spent a lot of time in looking at just finding I remember one of the first discussions was, I'll take the responsibility of going and studying what the value of data is. This was something I said I would do. But not much was found. Meaning I was trying to talk to some of my people that I know in the economics. So I was saying that, look, I'm giving Facebook this much of data, right? I'm giving Uber. I took a cab from here to the airport and Uber. Uber is getting so much of data from me, whatever the data is. What is the value of data that the way I have given it, Uber is making? Even some applications are not available, right? So that's the first problem, one of the first problems that I got actually interested about. The second one is about the earlier point that Parvinder was saying. So these new terms, all of that, Rahul, whatever said or not, we are actually getting very good response from across the world. No? We have talked, meaning at least Krish and even the earlier interactions that we've had, we have gotten good feedback from people saying that, look, we understand that these are slightly vague, it's hard to explain, all of that, but we're taking a step that nobody has thought about, no? Which also makes it more interesting, but I think we're also getting feedback about the things that we have developed, that it's interesting that from India, we're developing all this.
Absolutely. Like, in the changing geopolitical context, this framework coming out also, as you said, it's also getting traction, not just here, but I think, lots and lots of countries are also looking at what India is doing. Not just developed, but also developing world. And they are trying to see on, the changes happening. Because, if you look at the trajectory of technology policy landscape and updates that we are having here, it's pretty huge compared to what other countries are doing. So in that sense, I think, completely appreciate that, proactive policy making, understanding, and, that I think is really appreciated. We thank the committee for that. And, my next question was related to this only. So how do you place this in the geopolitical context? Because it seems that, this report is trying to enable data sharing for public good. And, this is a very well-defined cause. But if you look at the larger framework of the tech and the data landscape, for example, does it enable provisions for the government entering into agreements with other countries for sharing of data or processing of data for some other purposes and all? So those things, I think most of those things might have been considered by the committee, but given the scope of the work that you have defined, I think for that, I think that seems to have been out of this, because that is left to the government and the regulators to decide on how they want to achieve this. So I will move on to the second last question. So Parminder and Professor PK, you have explained on how do you see this happening. So like in your head, in an ideal scenario, how do you envision this concept or the framework be translated into practical use cases? Plus, what are the practical challenges do you think, or have you identified that you see, this is where I think we will hit, and this is where we need to correct or focus from, rough idea. I know that I don't want you to, go into details, but just rough idea. You, in an ideal scenario, how things you imagine to function, and what do you think would be the practical challenges when you implement this on ground?
Okay. So Rahul, and I think people, if they need to understand what this committee has done, think infrastructure. And even if infrastructure looks a vague word, I keep on telling people, think roads. Roads are which governments help make. After roads are made, then anybody can use it. And I think there is some perhaps confusion among people that when it is says for a good public good, then it cannot be used for a business purpose. It can be used for a business purpose, but business cannot directly ask another business for data. That's what has changed. But once government makes a road, the road is used for business, for entertainment, for family visits, for anything. So we are talking about making infrastructures. And Europe is doing it. Europe has a concept called data spaces. It has a health data space. It's got a industrial data space. Those data spaces are data infrastructures. They're very close, and they're circling around a problem and tell you why they couldn't take the jump, and we have taken it because we have a southern politics. And I've just written a paper. I'll share with you why we could do it and why their political economy did not allow them to do what India did before. But these data infrastructures, the concepts are important. The concepts that you will share the data and we will make the roads, and the roads will be used by all, is important. And I'll directly jump to, and people need to understand that unless they are roads, if roads are owned by big companies, big problem is we think the problem in some different ways, whether it's social media, whether it is Amazon, whether it is in agriculture. The problem is the roads are owned by the companies. The infrastructure is owned by the companies. If the infrastructure is community and public, all businesses can do equal work. That's the change this committee is doing, and Europe wants to do, is trying to do. What would be the practical things? Yes, these ideas are big. There is a big shift made, and that's why the company has taken, the committee has taken a very gradual view that one by one we will look at what area to go first. We have not one day switch and anybody can take anybody's data. A new regime comes, it's like 1947 or 1950. There is a new regime. It's not like that. We have given we say the law should be given that this can be done. The default right is of the community, but every step will be taken, and an HVD will be only made after the NPDA says this HVD can be made. It is also says use health as a pilot case. Learn as you go. So it was very important. It's a it's a egg and chicken problem. Unless you laid the foundation. So there were two problems. If you don't lay the foundation, nothing can be done. But if you laid a framework, then you are afraid everything changes on next Monday. So we have avoided that. We have laid the framework. The rights have been made. The power has been given, but the power will not be exercised. And there is a shield. The NPD authority will say, yes, today the time looks ripe that we will first start only with health data. It actually says, start with health data as a pilot. We'll make a health infrastructure. We'll do all the learnings which you are talking about. We will correct. And when we are very comfortable, then we'll go to education. Then we'll go to transport. So it's a very beautiful combination of powers being established by law and the practice being gradual and one by one. And in that, we will cross the bridge when we come, and the kind of problems you're talking about, they would be huge, which I and you right now, even if we keep on thinking, can't foreknow those problems. But this is how one by one we will go. And on health, I can assure you, and again, I'll tell you from the paper, that health data infrastructures, including community rights, are much more developed. There is a WHO framework with some community rights, and even US, which is the most private individual nation, recognizes some kind of collective rights on health data, right? So health is a good thing to start with. We make so much learning, then we can go to education, but only certain kind of education and perhaps not other kind of education. So this is how we will learn and go, and those problems will be taken care of. And the law would also evolve, I'm very sure.
Right.
So Rahul, Parminder gave you the view. So I'll tell you how we arrived. So I think you need to also understand what did we do to come here. No?
Right.
I think Sahana, when she had the slide, first slide or the second slide, she said, right, the committee met with people. So if you look at it, that meeting of the people also, there was a lot of thought went in. So first we met a set of people from financial sector, right? People who run banks. Then we spoke to people who were like Amazons and Microsoft. Then we met with people who are startups. Then we met with people who are, so to say, health. Meaning health, as Parminder is saying, health was one meeting that we had. We had many people come from different sectors of health and then give us inputs. So we kind of understood where things are. I mean, and the committee at that point in time felt like, look, health is something that we can talk, because I think financial sector was definitely another one, right? Because financial sector is generally more, so to say, matured in some sense in terms of security, in terms of privacy, all of that. But healthcare is one test case that we have started. Of course, we learn. But I thought I'll give you a background on how did we, I think Parminder gave you a nice view of importance of health, but I think we took some process to get there, not necessarily one day we met and we said that, oh, let's do health as the test case.
Thank you, Professor B. That was really helpful to understand the procedure the committee went through to arrive there. So I'll move on to the last question, and before we start the panel discussion, and this is on data trustees, and I have some questions around data trustees, because I think this is one of the centerpiece of this framework on everything will revolve. So when I read this, very interesting concept, and how it has tried to envision on how everything will happen around it. But some questions that come to my mind is, so for example, can given the data which is there with the data trustee, and given the data that the government collects, can the government asks data trustee, or can the data trustee ask custodians, or the government ask custodians based on the data which they have gathered to initiate some action? So for example, if your report says, the data which gathered says that 40% of people do not have updated, they have not updated their security patches. So can the government start pushing notifications to people that you need to do it urgently? Or is it only a one-way flow, and the government does not act on it, or go for data trustees? Any thoughts on this?
I think here, which is the data trustee and what data are you talking about? I want to be clear, because on security patches, what kind of HVD are you talking about?
No, for example, if that data sets is being made available with the data trustee, and they find out that there is a critical vulnerability which was out, and the systems have not been patched. So based on the data which is available with the data trustee and maybe subsequently government agencies, is there action which can be initiated with the data which is being submitted? Can data custodians be asked to take actions based on that?
See, I think there will be horizontal laws, and I want to PK come in quickly. Horizontal laws of different, this data trustee would not become a sovereign republics inside India, right? They only manage it, the available collection and availability of, say, transport data. There's a transport HVD. It takes data from all ride-hailing companies, put it together and curates it, and every transport startup can take business from it. That's what all horizontal laws of the government will apply on the trustees. If there is a cybersecurity law, for example, it has certain obligations. It will be applied. And there's a very beautiful statement in the report that trustee is also a data business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not trying to say that they will do business.
Absolutely.
They're only saying the obligations of data businesses apply to data trustees. So all obligations, government may come with a cybersecurity law that every data business have to on Monday of every third month give these reports. The data trustees are supposed to give all those reports, all security parameters. Governments, if they can give directions, then all directions. So they are like businesses in compliances for all laws which are regulatory law. So that would still be how it is. PK.
Yeah, so so this point Rahul came earlier also. I think the way that this report and the exercise, I think it's going to be placed, but all other things are going to be same, right? I don't know how this can work in vacuum, or I don't know why there is this thought process that, look, everything this will do separately. I think it's going to be placed in a machine. The machinery is going to still be the same. No, we're just trying to do something in a one wheel, small wheel, which can do something with the data. and hopefully make the entire machinery slightly faster because of some processes that we have built. But I don't think so. The goal is to change the entire machinery. We're just trying to explore only one wheel in the entire machinery.
Okay, thank you. I'll end with this, some small question related to data trustee, and this is based on the statement which is there in the report. It says the data trustees may identify opportunities for combining data from multiple, data sets obtained from data businesses for community benefit, and then these startups can work on specific use cases. So ultimately, it is the data trustee who is sort of deciding and defining what data is to gather, and sort of deciding and deciding how that data will be put to use. Is my understanding correct, or do you think there are it is the companies or the startups or in the organizations which will have a look at the data set and they will decide their own use case, and then they will approach data trustee? Or is it the data trustee sitting in the center, being as in acting as a center use case clearinghouse for using data sets?
See, the data trustee has to determine and has a very big responsibility of what is, let's say, infrastructural data. See,
right.
This is a huge thing. What is not infrastructure? What is infrastructure? Road is infrastructure. Your house front is not infrastructure. So, and it is a very complex thing, and it will evolve. It has to say that certain kinds of data, if all health startups have to have certain cancer data, certain vaccine data, etc. This looks like infrastructure data, but this looks like a competitive advantage data. So these are the boundaries which the data trust and NPDA have to keep on laying. It is a very complex thing, but they have to take a mind of, like, if I'm the road constructor, my mind will always be that I need to make a good road. How to make a good road? What all data have to be sourced? I will always be thinking that this road now requires certain kind of vaccine data, because it seems that this is a common data that everybody should need. Their job is to try to always think what infrastructure other businesses need, and they make it. The startups look what they have made and take it. It's open for startup organizations to suggest, of course, that you are not looking at it, sir, but this is an infrastructural need. So they can suggest, but it has to be accepted by the NPDA system and data trustee system to give it an infrastructure status. And I think it's a very good way to look at it, is to get an infrastructure status. The moment data gets an infrastructure status, then the data is in this mandatory loop. So there will be interaction between the users and the infrastructure developers, but the decision is of these people.
Okay, all right.
Is that I think, to give a concrete so to say answer to this, is that the discussion was that the startup should be able to take it. The data is available. I don't think so. The trustee can decide what a company startup which is doing, how they should use the data, what they should do. I don't think so. That's the way we're thinking. We're thinking that the data, as Parminder said, infrastructure should be kept, and it should be used for benefit by anybody and everybody.
Okay, but the report actually mentions that it is a data trustee who will decide on the use, not the companies which come up with their own use case and ask data trustees, can you fetch me this data?
Yeah, no,
because I need
no, they will never fetch. So again, they will not see, once they make a data infrastructure, it is very clear. There is a section, any entity registered in the country can, it's like an RTI application. I cannot ask you why, what is your purpose, what is your interest. You have a right to make an application. In that sense, the data is open. As long as security issues, etc., are not there, I will not keep on judging your intentions and judging why you need it, whether you should need it. No. Once the data is infrastructural data, then on security, I may have a security issues and all. Do you have proper security? Do you have pipes to plug into my system? I will take care of that, but on a non-discriminatory basis. This decision is of the user, as PK is saying. It's not that you qualify for a use or not. That's not a decision to be taken.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Parminder and Professor PK, for answering some of these questions. They're really useful, and I hope that participants like this. Over to you, Amrita.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you for asking the questions. Before I go to the panelists, there were a few questions which came from the community, which I would obviously want to ask the committee members before I go to the panelists. Two questions I would take. One is, how can personal privacy and NPD regimes be harmonized? This is one question. There are many, but I would take another question is there a proportionality between metadata proposed to be created with the creation of HVD? Would a lesser restrictive obligation enable a similar outcome? And is that worth considering?
So, Parminder, you're on mute, Parminder.
Parminder, you're muted.
See, first question was, how can they be...
How can personal privacy...
Yeah, I think there is no doubt in the minds of the committee. Personal data is a legally defined thing. Moment data's nature is personal, it is subject to the PDP Act. Moment its nature is non-personal, from personal, the non-personal will be anonymized. This is legal lines are drawn. I don't think there is any overlap at all. Moment is non-personal data, it is under the regulation of the non-personal authority. Second, about the proportionality, we would like to keep the metadata demands as low and light as possible. There should only be, and I'm going back again and again to the infrastructural thinking, it's only those data which are considered essential for AI or data business in particular sector, whether it's education, enrollment data in education, some basic performance data. These data may be important for any educational AI system to do business. Rest is their value adds. So I think the metadata requirements would be kept as light as possible, but I don't know what could have been a system which would have been less burdensome, but I'll leave to PK and yes, thanks.
Professor PK, do you want to respond or?
No, I think Parminder said
Right.
Just time also, let the panelists also speak, right? I'm sure panelists also need some time to speak.
Right. Thank you. So we have a set of more questions, but I will now go to the panelists. Firstly, I would request Professor Pingali to share his thoughts. We've been discussing a lot of the economic value of data and everything. So Professor Pingali, I would like to know from you the economic aspects, especially with context to the economic policy, whether there are any possible trade-offs and in this, and if there is anything else you would want to highlight here.
Sure. Thanks, Amrita, and thanks to both the committee members for providing a very detailed discussion on this topic. Let me also start with a disclaimer. I'm an economist, so therefore I know everything and I know nothing, right? So that's the nature of the world as far as my trade is concerned. And whether it's computer science or biology or healthcare, I consider myself an expert, that I have an opinion about everything. And at the same time, I'll leave the jokes apart here, actually. So let's actually begin. I have had certain interest in digital markets, and I've been looking a lot at platform markets for a while, understanding the economics and network effects and so on and so forth. And in that context, I got drawn into this fascinating argument of NPD and several discussions around it I've had with colleagues. So I actually am currently teaching a set of sessions on the strategies of digital markets, et cetera. And in that context, I'm coming into this discussion. I had read the second draft of the proposal, and I thought, for me as a professor who teaches management, I thought I'll point out to a few things which the committee could consider. First of all, thank you very much for putting together an attempt to come up with regulating the non-personal data part of it. So that's like absolutely much needed, I agree. But I think there are a couple of issues that I thought I would actually talk about. In the report, you guys keep talking about data being non-rivalrous, and I'm going to pick on that. When an economist talks about something being non-rivalrous, it means that my usage of data or my usage of that particular resource does not impede you from using that particular resource as well. But to that extent, possibly data. Information, I would argue, is probably non-rivalrous. Data, on the other hand, one has a question about. I mean, is data really non-rivalrous? I think the derivatives of data from the data, which I call as insights, if you will, business insights, if you will, they become a very crucial element. So therefore, in that context, is that non-rivalrous? Right, that's a question that I had that had come to me when I actually thought about. So now when we extend this discussion further, I've been doing some work on innovation and intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. So in that context, I have certain other question that comes to me. Now, when you make data to be available, every data to be available to everyone, and sorry if I got the entire construct a little different in terms of details, but when you're saying that data is available for everybody to use, you have a problem of commons. What we mean in economics as problem of commons is that when you have a common property resource, the contribution by an individual party would be rather less than what is socially optimal. Just to let you know, I also do experimental economics, and I'd run so many experiments with so many students across various age groups, professions, et cetera, you know that the problem of commons exists. When there is a common property resource, when you make something common property resource, the contribution that an individual makes to that common property resource would be less than what is socially optimal. So in that context, I have, again, one concern, if you will, that I'd like to point out. The concern being, if you make this, is there an incentive for the companies that exist right now, that data generating companies, to continue to generate data the way they see the way they do it right now, or would you see some impediments on incentives to generate data? And if you're saying that there is going to be an impediment in the incentives for generating the data, do you actually believe that the ultimate objective of it, which is consumer welfare, I'm talking from the business standpoint, will that be achievable? So that's a major question that I'm actually grappling with. If I were to ask and do a general survey and say, would you continue to generate data the way you would if it has to be shared with everybody? Would I actually end up putting in the same amount of work that I would normally do, or would I figure out various other ways to stop data from coming out? So that's a question that I think bothers me a little bit. In terms of the ability of the firms to use, the incentive of the firms, if you will, to use the data and build upon it for innovation. I know what I'm innovating. I know the brains are available out there. My rivals can also recruit, and rest of the stuff will follow. So that's a question that as an economist and as a management professor, I'm a little I can't help but think about. The next one I would actually argue with you is that while information is one, data, the way information is stored, is completely different, and there's a bit of an intellectual property associated with that. I'm pretty sure the committee is looking at the intellectual property angle of that particular aspect that I just talked about. But nonetheless, as a person who does a few sessions in every microeconomics class on intellectual property, I'm actually a bit curious to know on the intellectual property repercussions of what you're talking about. So to me, these are the 3 points. And the final one I would put out there. There is a difference between strategy formulation and strategy execution. Brilliant strategy, I think management literature tells you that brilliant strategies across the globe, no country being an exception here, have failed because the details of execution are missing. So in that context, what do we think about data privacy issues? What do you think about data security issues? What do we think about how the details are going to come through in terms of how data sharing is likely to happen? I'm going to really wait to look for the details out there, and only after I look at all the minor details would I probably be a little bit more comfortable with it. That's my humble submission. Once again, you should ignore, you should pardon me if my technical understanding of stuff is rather limited, but I said I'm again talking about it from just a pure person who teaches business management. And if I were to look at it from the business point of view, what is it that I see? I think I'm going to stop here, Amrita, if it's okay, and leave you with these 3 questions. What do we think about intellectual property? How do you think it will help innovation? And would you even think that the data collection that we're talking about will happen at the level that it happens? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pingali. I would next bring in Astha Kapoor from APTI. Astha, there's a lot of discussion going on about businesses. So I would like to hear from you. What do you consider or what do you foresee as the practical implications for businesses?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Amrita, and the CUTS team for having me. And also, it's such a pleasure to hear the two committee members discuss this. So, thank you so much. I know that Subhashish will also be talking about businesses, and Professor Pingali also mentioned it. But I wanted to start off by making a slightly, broader comment. First of all, I think that this draft, as has been said earlier, is a huge improvement on the the earlier version, and it's very nice to see that certain aspects that were quite problematic, such as B2B sharing, have been excluded, sovereign purpose has been excluded, and also the clarity that the PDP bill should not be mentioning NPD is good to see. What I wanted to also broadly say is that, and Parminder mentioned this as well, is that there are a lot of concepts in this in the committee report that need to be fleshed out further. Whether it's this idea of community data rights, and I know that the annex mentions it a little bit, but I think we need like a common vocabulary and understanding of what communities are and how they engage with each other. We need to understand what the relationship of the data principle is to the community. What is their level of association? What happens if I want to leave a community? Like, there's a lot of like unknowns with regard to community. The other is that, there's this, and again, the trustee concept was also discussed briefly, but I also continue to find it quite vague and hard to grapple with, because the role of the trustees in their relation to the community are not really clear. The duty of care is mentioned, and the custodian also seems to have a certain duty of care is mentioned, but unclear. Trustees are supposed to, escalate grievances to the NPDA through non-profits, but the role of the non-profits is also unclear. But also, trustees are data businesses, as Parminder also clarified. So there's a huge capacity issue that comes up. So I just feel like that concept also needs to be clarified much further. And then this question of anonymization, which is the sort of crux of the matter of making data non-personal. Like, who does that? Does this mandatory data sharing, like Professor Pingali also mentioned, does it incentivize businesses to anonymize, is the question. And now coming to the question of the businesses, Amrita, I mean, of course, mandatory data sharing, as has been envisioned in draft 1, has been, restrained a little bit in draft 2, which is good to see. But at the same time, I think that we need to create, like, just advocating for mandatory data sharing is not sufficient and is likely to see, people scuttle this rule in many different ways. What we need to do is to think about, like, what are the broad ecosystem parameters that are required for data sharing? How can we encourage businesses, big, small, also non-profits, which are huge data collectors now, and universities, etc., to share data better? What is required in the ecosystem? How do we think of questions of trust in the process of sharing? How do we create mechanisms that, I mean, there are examples again in the report, but also in places like Estonia, you have the X road that is, a data sharing layer that allows ministries at the moment, but also I think increasingly private sector organizations to share data in a safe, secure manner. So how do we create that an infrastructure? And we've talked quite a lot about infrastructure, but how do we create that data sharing infrastructure before we start to consider mandating the process of sharing? So I think that there's a huge gap in the suggestion of this mandatory data sharing on businesses, because there's also going to be a huge cost, a technical challenge, and a burden on businesses big and small to ensure that data is transferred and logged into the data metadata directory as mandated by the report. Professor Pingali also brought up the fact of whether businesses will still be incentivized to collect, process data in the way that they have been doing if it is mandated in the way that is recommended by the report. So I think my broad recommendation is, one, we need to slow down the process of the NPD conversation in many ways, and I'm very happy to see a draft 2. I hope there will be a draft 3, 4, 5, 6, because I think it's a much longer conversation. I think that we need to, these consultations and the idea of being able to engage with committee members is quite wonderful, and I think we should continue these conversations, because at the moment the way the report stands is quite conceptual. And I agree, Parminder, health is a great opportunity. We've been doing some work to think about what are the mechanisms for health data sharing that are reliable, that are trustworthy, and that can be expanded. But I think that the conversation is a broad one. And then finally, on this question of data sharing and the role of the businesses, is I don't believe that there should be this mandatory data sharing, because the systems to make it real don't necessarily exist, and we should take a much broader ecosystem-led approach where we address the mechanisms through data can be shared in a reliable, interoperable manner. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Astha. I would bring in Shubhashish now. Shubhashish works with a lot of startups or people, or they look at funding a lot of startups. So Shubhashish, I would ask the same question to you. What are the practical implications for businesses, especially startups, because they are in focus? And to all the panelists, just in case you have any questions like Professor Pingali had for the committee members, please do ask the questions. The experts would be taking it later. Professor PK would have to leave by 5:30, so we may extend a bit more than our timeline of 5:30, but we would allow Professor PK to speak, make his interventions first.
Thanks, Amrita. If it's okay with you, I might start with a few general comments before getting down to your specific question. So here's what I'd say. I'd say that among all the, having been in this kind of tech policy space for about 4.5 years now, of all the reports that have come out of committees, I think this is among the best ones, right? And the reason it is among the best ones is because we keep crying with every other thing that you're trying to do too much. This report really nails it in keeping it extremely narrow, being extremely explicit about what are the areas that it does not cover. So keeping sovereign things out of it, keeping some of the B2B data sharing out of it, etc., I think is an extremely good thing to do, which you don't see in Indian policy making as often. The second thing is, one might think it's maybe not the simplest, but it's certainly an extremely elegant mechanism through which data is flowing. It's almost like everything's above ground, right? There is these HUDs get created. The HUDs have to be made available on no discrimination basis, that there is the metadata directory that people can actually check out. So there's a lot of transparency in how things happen, which I think also very often does not happen because lots of regulation have more secretive elements. So to that extent, I really think we should commend the committee for taking on board all the feedback, 1,500, I don't know how they got through it, but in actually coming up with this kind of report. My concerns from the report come from the fact that at the end of the day, if this framework gets implemented like this, which it probably won't, right? Because there's going to be a legislative process after that, which the committee recommends, and things might change very significantly there. But if it does come into force in this kind of framework, then the truth of the matter is it's not going to be people like us who are going to be dealing with it. Parminder is not going to be, or may not be on the non-personal data authority. It's not going to be folks like us who will be it's not going to be people like us who are going to be on the data requesters, etc. The real life incentives and accountability mechanisms, because when this hits the road, lots of things might not play out as the theory would have said it does. And therefore, in that context, I have 3 specific recommendations in that sense, and then I'll come to your question about the businesses. Firstly, I don't see enough of incentives and accountability in this report. So for example, it and what I'm discussing with a lot of startups is their concern. Apart from their concerns, they say that it's very easy for us to bypass this by just feeding gibberish into the system. Someone asks you for data, give them terrible data, give them bad data or whatever. It's very easy to game the system. How do you make sure that the data provider is a responsible data provider and providing the right kind of information that has been asked for? um, how do you ensure that it is being only used for public good? Because it says that here are all the grounds on which the data requester can actually use this data. But why should they use the data like that? Even if they use it for something totally different, there's nobody to hold them accountable in this framework. So those kind of questions become really important. Data trustee. Data trustee has been asked to ensure that public good purpose is always met by data requesters. But how do you ensure it if you have no discretion? And if you have discretion, then how can you make the no discrimination kind of policy come to life? So this whole entire incentives and accountability mechanism, I thought, can be detailed a lot further. The second, which Asta's already alluded to, so I'll skip, is around the duty of care. It's been referred to in the context of both the data trustee as well as the the data requester, but I don't think it's in that, also the data custodian, but it's not necessarily been defined. What does it mean? And that creates ambiguity for businesses, because if you say that, look, you are responsible for the harms and you've not been told what these harms are, you've not been told how can you be held accountable, it's a problem for them. And finally, I think there's a very big missed opportunity here in bringing in some of the regulatory best practices. The NPDA will be a regulator. It's going to be an Indian regulator, and we know so much about Indian regulatory governance. And it would be a missed opportunity if in the next version of the report, the committee does not bring the best practices of Indian regulatory governance into this. We have seen Indian regulators have do not do as much public consultation. We know that they aren't necessarily as transparent in the kind of reports that they put out. We know that their boards are not necessarily either independent, they aren't independent, they don't have majority non-execs. And we know that in effect, they struggle if they have to regulate too many entities, and therefore to preserve their bandwidth, they almost create a system of scarcity. And if they end up creating a system of scarcity here, and if not enough HVDs are getting created, defeats the whole purpose of the bill. So I think these are the three things around incentives and enforcement, around the duty of care, and around the regulatory best practices that I think this report would do well in. I think it's really got its heart in the right place. I think it's got the fundamental right, and it's come some of these nut and bolt issues that need to be figured out. And now, Amrita, turning to your question about the startups and the impact on that. I think, look, having spoken to enough startups about these kind of things, the two things they always ask for is it has to be somewhat predictable. Right, it's the lack of predictability which often puts startups into a soup. Like in the sense that startups will do a certain thing, and 2 years later you told them they did the wrong thing. So in that context, I think what would be really important is to clarify some of these definitions, clarify some of these benchmarks on what basis they are set, clarify some of these obligations, clarify some of these accountability. As long as I think all of that happens from a startup perspective, one might argue it might not actually make that much of a difference, because does the public good actually purpose cover the commercial aspects of a startup? So the commercial interest, we don't know, and I suppose will be defined later. But from the perspective of, does this create additional costs for startups? For all we know, they might be below that benchmark. So it really depends on how these benchmarks are set. So I'll pause there, Amrita, and hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Shubhashish. Next, I bring in Amol. Amol, I want to know from you, do you foresee any regulatory overlaps between the NPDA and the other regulators?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amrita, for this opportunity. And also thank you to the members of the committee for being so open and forthright with receiving the feedback. Now, before delving into your questions, just uh, some broad thoughts on what committee members have said during this discussion, what we could grasp from the report. Definitely, I also concur with other panelists to say that this is a fantastic effort and much needed improvement over the previous version. But here are my few reservations before I move to answer your questions. First is, I completely understand this obsession to be leader in the world and take first mover advantage when it comes to regulating some of these issues which are non-regulated or less understood around the globe. But this need
to regulate or obsession to regulate without necessarily thinking about socio-economic realities of the country and the capacity of individual consumers, communities, and citizens at large may be counterproductive. Uh, I think we have in our country experiment a lot with the concept of regulation by intentions. We need to move beyond regulation or governance by intentions. We have had a lot of sort of bad experiences with things which were thought were good enough or were for the benefit of the country or citizens, but it didn't turn out to be that because unintended consequences and adverse effects of some of the knee-jerk regulatory reactions were not thought through clearly. The second thing is about state capacity, which is also somewhat related to what was said by Subhashish and Astha, and I don't want to repeat that, but uh, as I said, that the committee members might be clear in their head about what they want to achieve, but that might not really be what might be the text of the legislation and how it will be sort of implemented. And there is a real risk of getting the concepts and objective being lost in translation and using the powers which is mentioned in the report for some other purposes rather than for the public good purposes which is mentioned in the committee, which is mentioned in the report. And the third thing is about Parminder and others have said that the real idea is to consider data as an infrastructure here, and also a very fantastic lucid examples of roads. And I'm glad that this example was brought uh, uh, today, because as we speak, the country is celebrating the National Road Safety Month. And why we are celebrating this? Because the road safety is very important, and road accidents create a lot of adverse consequences and deaths to common citizens in the country. And this is important because roads, as we know, are sort of laid down by through a public-private sort of a partnership, which is also something which is envisaged by the country, by the committee. And therefore there is this sort of questions as to, okay, if you're saying that data is infrastructure and we should think about roads being sort of laid down, so then what about the rights of people who are sort of dispossessed, and who is responsible for rehabilitating them? What is that the only road that people are supposed to travel, or there could be some other roads, and whether there would be no sort of permission to travel through other roads which could reach to the destination sort of sooner? Or so is this the only way to do things, or there could be other ways? Because we have seen technology being the only mechanism to avail certain government benefits, and there is no sort of technology or manual override or no fail-safe mechanism in different context. What about sort of accountability? Is if the road design is bad, or if there are some accidents, or if there are uh, tolls which are sort of placed on for traveling to roads, there are real risk of exclusion from usage of roads, and therefore, by example, of usage of the public interest for which the data will be used by data requester when it is sort of used for public interest. And who will sort of tell you that, or who will sort of regulate whether or not the charges which are levied on citizens to use the road are reasonable or not? Who is responsible if there is some sort of a problem in terms of designs of road, or the material in which through which the road is constructed? So is data trustee accountable? Is the data custodian accountable, or is the data sort of requester accountable? So again, if you think about the experience of public private partnerships and infrastructure regulation, when it comes to sort of considering data as an infrastructure, there are real questions and real harms which the country has experienced, and we need to benefit from our experience, and not just sort of take into account benefits of considering data as infrastructure, or a road, but also think about what could be the adverse unintended consequences in this regard. uh, so these are like two sort of broad feedback or responses to to the committee. And now I'll come back to your questions on regulatory overlaps. I see regulatory overlaps and need for sort of regulatory coordination at different levels. Let's first start with philosophical level. Now, at philosophical level, the committee is saying that data is a sort of, it's invoking constitution, and it's saying that data is a material resource, and therefore it there is a need to sort of take it away from data monopolies and distribute it amongst citizens for greater good. Now that is okay, but the mechanism which it is proposing, that the data needs to go through the trustees, which there is a risk of resulting into data monopolies themselves, uh, is somewhat problematic, because at one hand you are saying that data monopolies are bad, and at the other hand you are again creating data trustees which might result into data monopolies, which in which there is less transparency, accountability. Also, there is this sort of a dichotomy about whether data actually is a material resource, because material resource is limited in nature, but data by definition is not limited, and therefore you could use it in the way you want it to be, you want to use it. The second sort of overlap I see is at conceptual level, and I think some of this has been discussed, but just for the sake of brevity, while the committee members seem to suggest that there is no sort of ambiguity or overlap between definition of personal and non-personal data, there is real risk of sort of lack of identification of if the non-personal data becomes identifiable, when did that happen during the value chain, and who is to be held accountable for that. So when it comes to sort of risks, harms, and breaches during the value chain and during the data sort of transfer, it might be a little bit difficult to sort of hold people accountable and identify when did the breach happen. The second problem, which perhaps is about the role of data businesses within the NPD framework and role of significant data fiduciaries under the PDP. So, is there sort of double regulation, over regulation, because you have to comply with some conditions there and you have to comply with some conditions there, which might actually result in regulatory arbitrage and data businesses. And also, given that there is a opt-out mechanism, there is a real risk of data, personal data not being anonymized, which has its own sort of privacy risks and other such risks. There is also sort of overlap in it when the committee says that NPDA is a regulator, but also is a repository of metadata directories. So in a sense, it also holds a lot of data, and what are the sort of security and other uh, features to ensure that these metadata directories are safe, secure, and not misused is something we'll have to think about. Another one is the role of is the scope of public interest, which the committee has said. So the scope of public interest includes innovation, employment generation, value addition, amongst other things, which are sort of good. And when we think about all these issues, these are really sort of in the domain of sectoral regulators or departments, because in their respective sectors, they are required to ensure the sector grows in a certain way, and there is innovation, and there is sort of equitable considerations are taken into account, and there is employment generation. So at one hand you are saying that the scope of public interest is innovation, employment, and on the other hand you are saying that there is no sort of conflict between sectoral regulators and the NPDA. So that is some problematic. And mind you, I'm not talking about only central or federal level regulators. There are regulators and government departments at the state level. So there could be a lot of sort of areas of overlap between central regulators, NPDA, cross-sectoral regulators like the Competition Commission of India, on which I'll come just a bit, and the proposed sort of e-commerce regulator, which might also be a cross-sectoral
Mhm.
regulator. And
Sorry to interrupt you, but if you do not mind, Professor PK would be leaving. Can we just have two responses? I'll come back to you if it's not an issue with you. He just,
Absolutely. Sure, sure.
I'm so sorry,
No problem.
but Professor PK, there are just two things which we would want to hear from you. One was what Professor Pingali actually elucidated to, and the second is how do you look at this report going from now, and what is your wish list, and what do you think may be the challenges? We can't hear you.
I will let Parminder also had, but I think the way that we are talking, we have already started getting the, so to say, we've been doing multiple consultations, even after putting the draft 2 out. We've had, like I think 2 weeks back, we had an industry consultation where some of us participated again, getting inputs. Inputs are coming from different places. We ourselves are also hearing the input, because this government process, wherever the inputs are coming, we're going to get it at some point in time. We'll have insights into the feedback there. And in the process, we have started getting looking at some of the feedback already and started revising. I think it's definitional. I think Astha was saying some definitions needs to be clarified. So Astha, just to give you a sense, in one of the earlier report, we actually had huge amount of content generated only for what anonymization is and different methods. This was something I was saying that, look, from the computer science point of view, I can give you, okay, here are different methods. I was also articulating that no methods can be foolproof. I think let's not assume that, oh, this anonymization kar diya, I applied company A, applied anonymization on it, and it will all work. It's not possible, right? It is going to be, so we spent a lot of time. And then when we are putting it out, we said that, look, this looks too detailed. This looks too, already the first version itself is so long, so we kind of cut it down. So it looks like something we probably have to go back and look at it. So I completely agree that some definitional information needs to be more clarified. All that we did from version 1 to version 2, but I think we're getting that back also. We'll definitely do that. So Amrita, your question to what is our wish list? I think the chairman and everybody is also trying to say that let's try and get the feedback sooner. I think the current deadline, if I'm right, is the 31st January. So once that comes out, about a couple of weeks later, we should have everything sorted out. So there is a very detailed process also we follow. We look at it, we kind of discuss each one of them, and then put it into some buckets, and then look at feedback. So that's what I think the process is going to be. I think Subhashish also mentioned about some of the best practices of NPD. So we've discussed a little bit. See, because I think sometimes the view is also that I think Subhashish rightly pointed out that we as committee members created, but there's going to be a huge process after that. No? We don't even, at least I don't have an insight on what that process is going to be. We are seeing that process for the personal, right? PDP bill. I don't know what all direction it's going to change, who's going to change what, how will it go. For now, our intentions are good that we want to try and make our best efforts in giving things. Hopefully, we'll also be part of the process of it getting converted, and we'll contribute in the process. Right? But I like what Amol said. I don't know, Parminder, whether you caught it. Amol said that there's an obsession to regulate. I don't know whether any of us have that obsession, please. I like the word that you said. Oh, we're being in this obsession of creating new things. I think that's what you said. No. I don't think so. The intention was that, look, nobody is doing so, we should do it. And I think we understand. Even in our first meeting, really first few months, we actually met with international experts. There were people from Hong Kong who gave us discussions about what's going on. There's somebody from the US who gave, UK, somebody actually came and gave us a presentation on what they are thinking. So we took some insights, but of course there is this, as Parminder emphasized, there's this also that this topic is not very well, so to say, discussed or done a lot of work, which we are also saying. We're also getting inputs that look across the world, this is not done, so it's interesting to do. So Amrita, that would be my next steps of adding some definitions, probably creating more clarity. I think even in the industry interactions that we had, some feedback had come very concretely. We had made a note of it. So that would be my next steps I would say.
Thank you so much, Professor PK. Professor Pingali had a question. Professor Pingali, would you want to ask the question again, just in case?
So this was regarding innovation and hurting innovation, right? I mean, that's the question that I had posed at the beginning stages, along with seeing that whether the data contribution ultimately we'll see would come down. Actually, the incentives to collect data in the first place would come down.
So Parminder, do you want to take it? But Professor Pingali, I did not. So I wrote down some of the questions that you had, but I'm not too sure where the thing of the innovations was come down, because we are in our discussion. We are seeing that some of these innovations, it can actually sparkle more innovations, but I need to really. I'll let Parminder also answer if he has a view on. Parminder, you're on mute again, Parminder. Sorry.
Economist carries an article 4 weeks back in which there is an Oxford professor who has done a research, and they have clearly come out that startups today have less of a problem of capital and more of a problem of data. That's a research, is an Economist article. I can forward it to you. Second, you were saying about disincentivizing production of data. That's an issue. Society's need is not production of data. It is also use of data. So use is the reason data is produced. So there are different trade-offs. The infrastructure formula increases the use of data. The same data which is in the hosts is being productively used. So the social benefit is in the maximum use of data. I can understand that increasing use can reduce production, and the production reduces, the total use will be reduced. No, that doesn't happen. First of all, we should recognize increased use is good for the society, not just increased productions. And second, there are many researches which shows that IoT data, platform data, most of this data is produced as a byproduct of digital services development and delivery. And this does not get disincentivized. There are many European papers that disincentivizing of production of this auto-generated data does not take place. There are special data. For example, somebody is using satellites to collect land data, or somebody has micro weather stations. Those are committed resource data. Some remuneration can take place on a utility basis for them. But 98% of the data is auto-generated data, which does not get disincentivized. So that would be my response to your question.
So a quick follow-up on that would be that there is something called...
Mr. Pingali, sorry, I'll come to you, but we have Professor PK who would want to leave, and Amol needs to finish his intervention, but I'll come back.
Sure. Yeah, I'll have to leave as well. So therefore, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. You can ask.
Sure.
Thanks, Amrita, for inviting us. Thanks for everyone for inputs. I think this is great discussion. Let's keep the positivity around. I think the goal is for all of us to put energy towards and create something which can help the businesses, different aspects. And I really think that some of you have spent a lot of time in reading the report, which also looks very nice. Thanks again for all the effort. Please submit your feedback formally. I know this process is there. I made some notes. I'm sure Parminder has made some notes. We can exchange it in the committee, but I will request all of you to formally submit it so we can actually take it more formally also. Thanks again.
PK, we will be sharing the recording also, as well as the report of the session, which I hope would be useful for the committee members.
Sure. I just hope that you're not putting the recording public.
It will be shared with people who want to hear it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Amol, would you want to continue? Sorry,
Sure.
I had to intervene in the middle.
No worries. And please let me know if I'm not clear or there are some audio issues. Should I continue?
Yes, please. If you could continue, and then we'll have Shahana coming in, and then there are some questions for Parminder.
Sure. Thank you. So just quickly completing on what I was saying. So I completely understand from where committees is coming, and it says that there is a need to have a specialized knowledge and keeping pace with rapidly evolving landscape, and therefore there is a need for a specific regulator on NPDA. But it also gives a lot of examples which are sector specific examples, and then it also acknowledges that sector specific sensitivities differ, and the pace at which technological evolution is happening differs from sector to sector. And in this discussion also members have emphasized on financial sector and health sector being different from the other sectors, and therefore it which basically results into question that when you are already acknowledging that different sectors have different sensitivities, involve different kinds of data which will need to be sort of dealt with, and different pace of developments, then why do you need a separate regulatory agency, and why can't the sector regulator in collaboration with the Competition Commission of India and the Personal Data Protection Authority could deal with the risks and the need to sort of ensure innovation and employment generation and other public interests that you have envisaged in the report. Also, there when I had sort of thought about interaction between CCI, the Competition Commission of India, and the proposed non-personal data authority, I think the committee has said that yes, CCI mostly deals with anti-competitive effects, so it's ex post sort of a regulator and not necessarily ex ante, and therefore there is a need for sort of ex ante. Uh, but however, I think when you look at the philosophical level of what the committee is trying to do, it's actually trying to deal with the problem of data monopolies or misuse of data monopolies, and that is really a competition question. And while we completely understand that the Competition Commission of India, as it is sort of formulated today, or the capacities are limited and it is not doing as much as it should, but that doesn't mean that you take away from the authority of Competition Commission of India and create a new authority which might or might not work. So it's sort of good to work with what is there and what has proven its worth over a period of time, and help it improve its capacities rather than creating a new animal altogether. The competition regulators in different countries is now dealing with these issues, and they have started sort of consultations, and India is also not very far away. So I think it's sort of a wrong assumption that CCI may not be in a position to deal with the challenges. It's just that we need to support it. Other than that, I think there are issues with respect to sort of excessive delegation at the NPDA level. It will do a lot of stuff when it is formulated, and sort of best practices of regulatory governance, uh, uh, which Subhashis has talked about, is very necessary. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that it is absolutely essential to do some sort of a cost benefit analysis and ensure that the costs of what the committee is proposing, or do analysis of what of the cost of what committee is proposing is outweighed by the potential benefits of the consequences of what the committee is proposing, if that is implemented in the manner in which it is envisaged. So, as I said, there are also problems of or issues of regulatory overlaps or coordination at state level as well, and therefore that is something that might need to be thought about. And therefore, I think how to. So the question is then how to ensure regulatory coordination, and how do we fix all these issues of regulatory overlap. So, as I started with sort of
You would have
philosophical,
to contain your
just
intervention.
30 seconds.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm just coming to the end. So as I had started with sort of philosophical argument, let's start with first principles questions first, and actually question what is the market failure, and what is the rationale for having a separate regulatory body, and whether the objectives cannot be met by existing regulators, and then sort of think about the regulation. Start with open data sharing first. I know that there was some regulation, and Parminder had answered in the chat box that open data sharing is not within the scope of the committee, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't start with open data sharing. There is a lot of data which government already has, which has been collected through sort of public taxpayers money, and that is where we should start data sharing, and ensure that capacity in startups is there to use and leverage that data. And uh, just on some mechanisms to ensure coordination, we have talked about sort of MOU between regulators or ensuring mandatory consultation between regulators. But some of these mechanisms may or may not work. There are new mechanisms which are coming up globally, such as creating a inter-regulatory body to discuss developments and ensuring mutual learning, to have overarching policy in terms of say competition policy or data policy, which lays down vision for different sector regulations, and also a policy coherence unit to deal with the problem of lack of coordination and coherence. So I'll just stop here and happy to take further questions.
Thank you, Amol.
Thanks a lot.
Shahana, I know you have to leave. Quickly, if you can share, what do you see are the concerns, NPD versus PDP?
Thanks, Anita. And I'm going to keep my comments very brief because I do have to jump off for another call. But I think one is that, I do share my co-panelists kind of heartened by the reiterated version of the report. I think this is the first time in my experience as a policy lawyer that we've seen a committee actually engage with the feedback that has been submitted. That is fairly apparent in the reiterated version of the report. So that's been really heartening to see. I think talking specifically about the interaction with the PDP and the NPD frameworks, I think while the report has done a fantastic job in kind of stressing that the governance frameworks should be entirely different, could not agree with that more. I think that's done and dusted. Absolutely agree with that. But I think there are a couple of issues that still kind of linger, and it's while we recognize that this is meant to be a policy document, that this is meant to be provide high level guidance and recommendations on what are the contours and what are the boundaries of this governance framework. I would like to see a little bit more engagement on some of these issues. So while the governance frameworks for NPD and personal data are meant to be separate, the committee recognizes that. It still continues to look at a couple of concepts from the privacy framework, and I'm wondering how that will ultimately play out. So, for example, coming back to what some of the other co-panelists have said, is that where is the we need to see a little bit more in terms of where is the liability framework, where is the accountability framework here, right? When we are saying, for example, that some non-personal data should have similar storage requirements as certain types of personal data, what are the contours on how do you ensure that all of the stakeholders in the NPD governance ecosystem will follow through on that? How do you build mechanisms to ensure that once the data has been shared from one entity to another entity, that all of these requirements continue to be met, especially when the characteristics of that non-personal data may not always be obvious, right? I think other issues like having data users opt out, giving them the opt out option. I think yes, absolutely empowering the data user, but then again, we do have to think of mechanisms that will truly enable those rights, right? That will make those rights meaningful. So that means that there will be an entire chain of where the data has moved from one entity to another, that will have to ensure that if a data user decides that their anonymized data, they don't want it used anymore, they don't want it processed anymore, you need to ensure that there will be a mechanism that will meaningfully comply with that right, that will meaningfully implement that right. And so I think there will need to be a little bit more engagement that ideally we would like to see, in terms of what is the engagement, what are the overlaps, what are the contours that kind of touch each other between the NPD and the PDP framework. I think, again, just in terms of what is the liability, what is the accountability over here. Some of my co-panelists have talked about the data trustees accountability framework. As a lawyer, you look at the duty of care as being one of the checks and balances imposed on the data trustee, right? I think the question is that sufficient? Do we need to have more in terms of having accountability for the data trustees to ensure that they behave in the way that will ultimately give leverage to these HVDs? So I think the short point is that the the on the kind of overlaps and the touch points with the PDV framework, I think yes, definitely there needs to be a little bit more. Ideally, we would like to see a little bit more engagement on that issue. Some of the principles absolutely make sense. So one of the things that the report has said is that where there are data sets where NPD and PDB, for example, are inextricably mixed, that data set will continue to be subject to the PDP framework, right? I don't know if that is an opportunity, like Subhashish said, to have entities game the system. I don't know if that means that you're creating opportunities where you are allowing entities to take a call or determine for themselves, evaluate for themselves that, listen, this data set is actually subject to whole another framework. It is not NPD, and so I don't need to share it. Completely, will kind of defeat the purpose of a framework like this. So I think there will need to be a little bit more engagement that we would ideally need to see, and would definitely support more engagement and more thought given to some of the liability frameworks, some of the accountability frameworks, not just for the data trustees, but also what are some of the mechanisms that we can put in place that we need to start thinking about now to ensure that the various rights that attach to that data are followed through in the entire ecosystem, that those rights are really meaningfully enabled throughout the ecosystem. So with those very short comments, I'm going to hand back to you, Amrita, and thank you again for this opportunity. I'm going to have to jump off, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Shahana, for being here and sharing the overview. I'll just quickly bring in Astha because Astha has to leave. Astha, last question to you. I guess you had a question for Parminder, if you want to ask the question. And two, what is your last thoughts you would want to share?
Right. I guess my question for Parminder was on, the data altruism approach that the DG has taken and how you sort of view that as a counterpoint to the mandatory data sharing approach that the NPD has taken. And in terms of last thoughts, I think a lot has been said about, the big question of whether we need an NPD regulation at all. And I think we all keep circling back to that in many, many ways. I think Amol's comments also brought that out quite clearly. And I think that we should keep that on the table, and it would be okay to do this exercise for the next couple of iterations and decide that by then we'll know what the PDP is doing, we'll know how some of the questions on competition come to fruition, and I think then by we'll have a bigger sense. So I just wanted to say that we should make sure that we, as all good social scientists, you should have a hypothesis and be willing to be proven wrong. And I think with the NPD, that should be also something that we should keep in mind. And then again, the point that I brought up about better clarity on definitions and also the roles and responsibilities. And then finally, I think that as people who are interested in this, and we are doing some of this at APTI, is that we need to take some of these concepts and start to test them out. So what does this really look like in the implementation? What does this really feel like? We should possibly be investing more time in thinking about pilots with regard to data trustees and also some kind of regulatory sandboxes to think through some of the issues that the NPD has brought up, because, and of course there are politics around the sandbox question as well, but I think that we need to test this out before it becomes a regulation, if at all. So and the NPD committee and the process should afford us the time to test some of this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Astha. Parminder, there are a few questions for you. There are some in the chat. Kumar Deep had a few questions. Ricky had a question, and there were a few more in the chat. How would you like to go about? Would you like to answer Astha and then go, or should I share the questions once again to you?
I can answer Astha's, try to answer Astha's question, and you can keep on picking from the chat which you think, because there's limited time here. Astha, I've been dealing with the issue of self-regulation of internet since the World Summit on Information Society for 15 years. And I thought by 2021, we would have left self-regulation apart. We have seen enough, not only power disbalances, but huge problems in the internet and digital ecology, which come right to our doorsteps, whether it is media, whether it is economic justice, you name it. And there is the need for hard regulation. So now to say that data would self-regulate, and not only self-regulate, data altruism is going to solve our problem, really, I'm not sure whether it's really worth getting into a discussion even that when we say one thing, and I want to take it as a general answer to many questions which have been raised, which says, first of all, we need to agree whether there's a problem. Whether there is a problem of huge power disbalance between countries, and the US and China have become centers of AI, and the rest of the world is getting down completely away. One geo-economic aspect of it. And if geo-economics is not one subject, consumer versus platforms, whether it's the social media power of a Facebook or Twitter, or Amazon's power in one space on agriculture companies who get digitalized their power. Now, unless we agree that there's a huge disbalance of digital power, we don't even have to go down the line of discussing something else. And if we do agree that there is a problem, and a lot of people think there's a problem, the newspapers are full of problems. At the heart of this problem, everybody agrees, is a disbalance of data. Data is the source of digital power. And where is the question that self-regulation and altruism, or even I have heard of saying that let sectors solve it themselves, or competition authorities solve it. They are not solving it. We are in the middle of a huge problem of huge digital disbalance between countries, between people and platforms, and nobody is solving it. And everybody agrees that data is at the heart of that problem. So how could we, without regulating that central thing, which is at the heart of the problem, solve the power disbalance? And in nowhere in history, core economic and political power has been solved by altruism or self-regulation. This is known. We can take those soft aspects. And if you are talking about the European idea of data altruism, which has come into Data Governance Act, I have problems with it, but also remember that the same act clearly says that it was not our job to talk about rights of data access. And there is a Data Act, which is going to come in 2021, which talks about right to access of business to business data. They are talking of rights to access. So they are not talking about data altruism. Data altruism is one form they have talked about. They said a Data Act in 2021, and they're very clear. We'll talk about the right to access data in a B2B framework. They have said there would be mandatory data sharing. These are things. So we have just come earlier and do it. How would the globe's data problems, which are so intense and huge around us, would either be solved by altruism, be solved by sectors? A health sector.
Can I take the next question?
Regulator. No, I actually was answering some of the questions which have come during the panel discussions, like whether sectors should solve it, whether competition authorities should solve it. So I'm just saying that none of this, and I'm ready to have any clear solution that this is the way data problem will be solved by a sector. Health sector is not in a position to lay allocatory principles around data. That's not a job of health. They cannot lay allocatory principles around the value of data. This is a horizontal regulation. So, but go ahead, Amrita, I'll take other questions.
Parminder, the next question is there a need to clarify several concepts proposed in the NPD, such as the role of data trustees or the community?
Yes, absolutely, there is. But again, there are always hierarchy of issues. Some issues are upstream, some are downstream. If I don't agree, for example, that there should be a right, there is no question of agreeing or disagreeing about the implementation of the right. the committee and Shahana said rightly that when you have a complex issue, you have to first solve the upstream issues. First, you allocate a right. Allocation of right is a very complex manner this committee is trying to do. Once we agree that I agree that there should be a right, but this is the way practical problems come in the implementation. I'm completely in agreement. There would be a problem. So what is the community? What are the accountability frameworks? Again, Shahana was saying, what are liability frameworks? But first to mention that there will be a duty of care framework here. Once you're talking about that framework, there is only limited space to go out and precisely say what would be the contours of the institutional structure, for example, of a data trustee. So the problem is about what to say or what not to say. When you're dealing with an upstream issue, you have a limited number of pages you can devote in a report. Should you devote 10 pages to an institutional structure of NPDA when the decision whether there should be mandatory data sharing or community should have a right to its data has not been sorted out? So the problem is about hierarchy of issues, and you solve the top issues first. And if they are agreed to, there are many processes to solve others, though I completely agree that community and data trustees would be issues that will take decades to completely stabilize.
Thank you, Parminder. Kumardeep, you had a few questions, but could you summarize it into one or two in case you want to ask?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I have switched off my video. Can you hear me?
Yes, Kumardeep.
Yes.
Thank you, Parminder. Very quickly, so as I understand that, and you have clarified earlier also that the sovereign purpose data sharing has been excluded, or data sharing for sovereign purposes has been excluded. And if I'm not mistaken, it is with reference to, it sits under clause 8, subsection 2 on page 23 of the NPD report. Am I correct in understanding that the report is not suggesting any further regulations for sovereign purpose data sharing?
The report is not suggesting regulations. Again, to try to deal with the most important and a pretty difficult issue of mandating data sharing for data infrastructures to support India's digital industry, which is a very complex issue. We are the first ones trying to do something about it. We had to invent new concepts to focus on that. It did cut down with other areas where I don't say that more work did not be done. I'm very sure, and my personal view is that government's access to society's NPD would need some kind of frameworks as we go forward. We just said, you don't have to use the community rights framework to take that data. You do something else, find out some other way, but community rights framework is for economic development, for public good purposes like the ones we are trying to talk. Sovereign purposes have a different channel. We are not touching it. So we've just kind of sidestepped it rather than said it should be done or it should not be done.
Thank you, sir. Very quickly, there are some data localization requirements, even though from the first report it has been brought down, which seem running or in a way, running up or running against the very idea of data anonymization. So, I mean, the very concept is a little, difficult to understand as to why data localization would be required within a NPD framework. I mean, what is the idea behind, if I may ask, the committee suggesting?
Why did you say that it goes against data anonymization?
Because, sir, I mean, the moment you say that non-personal data is a de-anonym or an anonymized data set, by definition, it can sit anywhere. It is not a security threat.
There's no definition. Okay, I got your point. There's no definition. Everything is by law. Law can come and lock my house down also. So there's no definition where anonymized data can sit anywhere. First of all, that there is anything technically can be done and law cannot do, we should disabuse ourselves of that knowledge. First of all, the reason is very simple. If government of India has certain economic laws around certain NPD, and that NPD is taken away the day it is produced in some other place, how would a country enforce its economic law over it? That's the reason. That's one very good reason. Though in this case, the committee is not saying that all NPD is something which has to be localized. But rule of law generally is territorial, and rule of law is a good reason for localization. Here, the sensitivity purpose, Kumardeep, is that a lot of data is sensitive. Even mobility data, do you recognize that the mobility data, the fact that on Monday mornings around this area, there is much more congestion than in these areas, is actually security-wise sensitive data? This world is moving towards, and I'm deliberately giving extreme examples, smart bombs, which would like to make maximum damage by least explosive power. And if you know the distribution of population at given times of a different days, itself is a security issue. So there are many ways NPD, and this is not a personal data, this is anonymized data. I can give you many other examples like health data, which can get misused. Non-personal data of certain communities, of certain patient communities, even if anonymized, can be exposed to certain risks when not under rule of law. So there are many sensitivities on NPD data as such, and there is no definitional thing that anonymized data cannot be stopped from crossing border. Though this committee has tried to keep that requirement minimum.
Thank you, sir. I could have gone on, but I think there is a paucity of time. Yeah, thank you, Amrita. Yeah.
Yes, Parminder, fantastic, excellent job. If everything is superlative. I just was curious, how deeply have you studied the existing open data frameworks in India? India was one of the early movers. How much has the startup ecosystem used the open data? And could we not have a graded kind of an approach to non-personal data, starting with the open data sets and then going on a little further? So just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
See, this world is, if I don't want to do anything, I have 1,000 reasons not to do it, right? Governments are the way they are. We can always say, can't we improve education before we improve health? Can't we improve primary education before we start schools? It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. Either I like something or I don't like it. And when I don't like it, I have got 20 reasons. And if I like it, I've got 40 reasons. So things are different. One ineffective area is no reason not to go to another effective area. Right now, world's data lies largely with a few large companies. Whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's agriculture, urban development, this is the source of both wealth, public interest, etc., which was not true even 6 years back or 7 years back. When we talk about open data, this is first decade of this millennium, or actually the last decade of the last millennium kind of movements. They're very important there. They're very good there. They should be improved, but there is no either or there. Right now, at the data economy is the invention, even not of the first decade of this millennium. It is the second decade invention. People mostly didn't understand data even 5 years back. And governments need to keep pace. Societies and policies need to keep pace. That's it.
Thank you, Parminder. Another question which was asked was that, asking for mandatory data sharing may entail some considerable regulatory cost. So how does the proposed regime envision to balance this?
I don't understand meaning of regulatory cost in the sense of the regulatory burden or regulatory cost. Regulatory burden is on those who are regulated, and regulatory cost is on the regulators. Whichever way, when data is at heart of the world's economy and going ahead, data is going to be the single most important resource. It's data which will decide, I'm very sorry to quote an extreme example, the contest between India and China. It's not even the guns on our northern borders. It is whether you can leverage data and be a big, large, powerful country. So when you're talking about this kind of an, I wouldn't call it a commodity, but this kind of a thing, its regulation does not have any cost. The non-regulations cost should be seen. That if you don't regulate data, what happens? And therefore, the regulatory cost of getting 10 people in some office somewhere, I don't see it's huge with respect to what are you trying to deal with.
Thank you. One on geopolitics, like this is the, India's NPD is a very ambitious project, one of its kind in the world. How do you plan or how do you see it being taken globally as an example, and others also following suit? As in, you've been in this ecosystem for long, how do you envisage this?
I think developing countries are completely feeling that they're losing out. I mean, I go to international meetings in South Africa, whether it's Philippines, whether it's Zimbabwe, everybody knows that it is like industrial colonization. We are in those periods of the late 18th century where the world was changing because industrial revolution had come. There was colonization because of industrial revolution. Before industrial revolution, India was richer than UK, by far was richer than UK. So what happened suddenly? Because the new technology came. We are in that kind of a period, and political leaders recognize there is a problem, but none of them see what to do. Everybody even started talking about data is big issue, but this is the first framework which says data can be leveraged for your own development. And I think developing countries are very keen. Actually, we are already talking with many countries. I mean, in this case, not the committee, because I work with many developing countries. I work with South Africa. I work with the South Center, which is an intergovernmental organization of developing countries. And they're keen to look at this as something. We have given presentations to them. So developing countries are looking keenly at it, but I can assure you, even Europe would take something from it.
Thank you. I'll come back to you, Parminder. Amol, any questions for Parminder or your last thoughts on this?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amrita. And thank you, Parminder, for taking up so many questions and clarifying your position. I think just some last comments. I don't think anybody is saying that there is no need to tackle the problem of large data monopolies, but creation of another set of data monopolies to tackle the existing problem seem to be quite far-fetched. Is what my understanding is. The second thing is also an assumption that existing regulators because they are not doing anything right now, will not be able to do anything going forward, and a new regulatory regime which will suddenly drop from the air and will remove all these disparities is something which is too hard to sort of believe and trust. The third thing is that if I completely understand that there is a issue of prioritization and you need to sort of focus on some key big picture issues, and I think that is why when you say the problem is not of either or, we need to work on everything, and therefore the issue of only sort of taking non-personal data as the committee has envisaged and not talking about open data is something which, again, what you are suggesting is an either or. You need to also talk about open government data and also think about using non-personal data in public interest in a clearly defined mechanism, because public interest as is defined currently may not necessarily mean public interest and it could be misused. There are several sort of concerns. So clearly defined sort of scope of public interest, and then sort of working around that could be one of those ways to think about. I think I'll just stop here, and thank you so much for this opportunity, Amrita.
Thank you, Amol. Parminder, I would like to thank you for patiently taking all the questions, being here over time. One last question is, how do you see this draft going from here? What are the challenges which you foresee in this journey? And what are the next steps?
Yeah, before I say that, Amol, please don't call a data infrastructure as a data monopoly. If we can't differentiate between data being with, say, Amazon and Google as a monopoly, and it's being pooled together, whether in a data trustee, and call it as a monopoly, I think just abuse of that term. Second, going forward, it's not clear. I think we did completely go through all not all, I mean, we pooled together all the comments, we analyzed the comments and visited with 7 and 8 buckets of those comments, each part of the report, and see where things can be changed, improved, deleted, everything. The very idea that there is another consultation means that those things would be again taken account of, and the report will again be put to that prism and judged from that prism. Having said that, my feeling is that committee members do believe that their basic ideas of the high-level ideas of what is needed and how it has to be done are not shaken at all, and they continue to be. And there would be other things which can be improved, and they will be improved. Generally, what will happen next is a decision which committee makes when it meets, and after 31st, one thing is for sure, that we will look at the comments and see what changes can be done. That's for sure. How it will be done, what will be the next process, I have no idea.
Thanks a lot, Parminder, and thank you everyone for patiently being here for all this while and hearing and being part of it. We will be sharing the recording and the report in a few days' time. Please do make your submissions. That is something which is important, because your voices do matter, and the more views and you can share, the better it is. Parminder, any last words before we
No,
finish?
thanks so much. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
All
everyone.
these discussions help us a lot. I mean, as PK was saying, that these are also parts of consultation, and every question we take both may help us drop something or strengthen what is already being done, because people may think that this is not being understood in this manner. So that's very useful. Thank you for inviting me.
Rahul, anything? Or thank you?
No, just thank you. Thank you to everyone who has stayed back to listen to the views of the participants and the panelists, and especially the committee members. Thank you, Parminder. Thank you, Professor PK is not here. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. I think these are really important. Keep your questions coming. That is what will stimulate more thinking and generate more thought leadership into how we can further improve this and make this a better report. Thank you. Thank you.